She was already in the lobby of the funeral home when I walked in. I want you to picture that for a second. The casket she picked out was open behind her. There was a photo of me on an easel, that one from my college graduation, the one Mom always loved. And my older sister was standing there in a black dress she'd clearly bought new for the occasion, accepting a casserole dish from our neighbor, Mrs. Petrosian, like she was the one who'd lost something. She turned around. She saw me. And the sound that came out of her wasn't grief. It wasn't relief. It was the sound a child makes when their toy gets taken away. My name is Marigold Hennessy. I'm 29 years old, and 3 days before that moment in the funeral home, my sister had stood over me in the snow on a county road outside Bemidji, Minnesota, watched me bleed out from the steering column of my own Subaru, and then walked back to her car and driven away. She didn't call 911. She didn't flag down a passing truck. She got behind the wheel of her Lexus and she drove all the way back to our parents' house in St. Paul. And the next morning she filed a missing persons report so beautifully tearful that the desk sergeant offered her tissues. But before I get to the funeral home, before I get to the look on her face, I need you to understand who my sister was. Because the worst part of this story isn't what she did to me on that road. The worst part is that I should have seen it coming for 15 years. Her name is Sutton. She's 4 years older than me. And from the time she was about 12, there was something in her that worked wrong. I don't say that lightly. I'm not one of those people who throws around words like sociopath because someone was mean to them in high school. I'm a registered nurse. I work in a cardiac step-down unit at a hospital in Minneapolis. I know what mental illness looks like, and I know what it looks like when someone is just rotten in a way that has no diagnosis. When Sutton was 16, our cat Mochi went missing. We searched for 2 weeks. My mom put up flyers. I cried myself to sleep every night. We found Mochi eventually in a duffel bag in Sutton's closet behind her winter sweaters. She'd been dead for at least a week. Sutton said she found her like that and didn't know what to do, so she put her in the bag. My mother believed her. I didn't. When Sutton was 19, her boyfriend at the time, a sweet boy named Theo who worked at the campus bookstore, broke up with her. 2 weeks later, Theo's car was firebombed in his parents' driveway. Police never proved who did it. Sutton had been at a sorority function with 16 witnesses, but I remember her sitting at our kitchen table the morning after, eating yogurt, and when my dad mentioned the news on the radio, she looked up at me and smiled. Just for a second. The smallest smile. And I knew. I started keeping my distance after that. I went to nursing school in Duluth specifically because it was 4 hours from her. When I graduated, I took a job in Minneapolis, close enough to see our parents on weekends, far enough that I never had to be alone with her. But Sutton had a problem in the year leading up to all of this. Several problems, really. She'd married a man named Brendan 3 years earlier, a real estate developer with a smile too wide for his face, and the two of them had been hemorrhaging money in a way our family didn't know about until later. Brendan had borrowed against properties he didn't fully own. Sutton had been hosting these absurd Instagram-perfect dinner parties with rented furniture and ordering custom cabinetry for a kitchen they were going to lose. By that December, they were 2 payments away from foreclosure, and Brendan had taken out a loan from a man in Chicago who didn't carry a business card. I didn't know any of this. I just knew that when our father died of a sudden heart attack the previous October, the will had divided his estate evenly between his 2 daughters. About $400,000 each after the house sold. Plus, a life insurance policy I was the sole beneficiary on because Dad had set it up years ago before Sutton got married and never changed it. $350,000 payable to me alone. Sutton found out about that policy at the reading. I watched her face when the lawyer said my name. She didn't say a word. She just folded her hands on the table and waited for the meeting to end. And then she hugged me and said, "I'm so happy Daddy took care of you, Goldie," and used the nickname she hadn't called me since I was 11. That was October. By December, she was inviting me up to a cabin our aunt owned outside Bemidji for what she called a healing weekend. Just us girls. We never got to grieve him properly. I almost didn't go. I had a shift on the Saturday I was going to have to swap, But she'd been crying on the phone. She'd been calling me every other day for a month, and I thought, maybe she's actually changing. Maybe Dad dying broke something open in her. I drove up Friday afternoon, December 19th. The sky was the color of dishwater. There was already 6 inches on the ground and forecasts said another 8 to 12 overnight. Sutton was waiting at the cabin with a bottle of Pinot Noir and a fire going and a charcuterie board she'd clearly assembled to impress somebody who wasn't there. We talked for hours. She cried about Dad. I cried about Dad. She told me Brendan was going to therapy, that they were trying to start a family, that she'd been seeing a counselor of her own. She said she wanted to be a real sister to me. She said she was sorry for everything she'd done as a teenager, that she'd been a different person then. I believed her. I want to be clear about that. By 11 o'clock that night, drinking her wine, sitting by her fire, I believed every word. The next morning, she wanted to go into town for breakfast. The roads were a mess. The plows hadn't come through yet on the county route. She suggested we take my car because it had the better tires. Her Lexus was rear-wheel drive, and she said she didn't trust it. I said, sure. I want you to understand something here. The brakes on my Subaru had been recently serviced. I'd had a full inspection in November. There was nothing wrong with my car when I drove up to that cabin. I don't know exactly when she did it. Probably while I was in the shower that morning. Probably while I was making coffee. The garage at the cabin was unheated and detached, and I'd parked in there to keep the snow off. She had a 30-minute window, maybe 40. She'd looked up something on her phone the night before. I noticed her scrolling through what I thought were recipes. I found out later, when the police pulled her search history, that she'd been reading about brake line tampering for 3 weeks. She made me drive. Said she was a little hungover. I didn't question it. The county road out of the cabin runs about 9 miles before it hits the highway. There's a long downhill stretch about 4 miles in, where the road bends around a frozen lake and drops maybe 300 feet over the course of a half mile. I came around the curve at maybe 35, tapped the brakes for the descent, and there was nothing. The pedal went to the floor. I pumped them. I downshifted. I yanked the parking brake and it caught for about 2 seconds, and then the cable snapped. That's what the report said later. The parking brake cable had been cut partway through, just enough that load would finish it. I tried to steer toward the embankment to slow down. The car hit a patch of glare ice, fish-tailed, and went off the road into the trees at probably 50 miles an hour. I remember the sound. I remember thinking very clearly, this is how I die. I remember the airbag going off and tasting copper and feeling something hot running down my left side. And then I remember Sutton's face. She had a small cut on her forehead from the airbag. Otherwise, she looked completely fine. She unbuckled her seatbelt and she leaned over me, and I thought she was going to help me. I tried to say her name. She put her ear next to my mouth. She listened to me breathe. And then she sat back and she looked at me the way you look at a fish on a cutting board, and she said, "Oh, Goldie, you really are stupid." She got her purse from the floor. She got out of the passenger side. She made it look like a struggle, but I could see her in the side mirror. She walked around behind the car, looked up and down the empty road, and then she just started walking back toward the cabin. Not running, walking, with her phone in her hand, texting. The temperature outside was 9 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind chill was -18. The driver's door was crumpled into the tree and I couldn't open it. My left leg was pinned under the dash. I had a 4-inch gash along my ribs from where the door had buckled inward. And my sister, who had just heard me breathing, had looked at me and decided I would die in that car before anyone found me. I want to tell you that I'm tough, that I crawled out and walked 7 miles through a blizzard. I didn't. What happened was that a snowmobiler named Cal Whitaker, who I will think about for the rest of my life, came through that stretch of road about 90 minutes after the crash. He'd taken a wrong turn off the trail system. He saw the skid marks. He saw the broken trees. He found me semi-conscious, called it in on a radio, and stayed with me until a county ambulance got there. I don't remember the helicopter. I remember waking up in a hospital in Duluth 36 hours later with a tube down my throat and a state trooper sitting in the chair next to my bed. His name was Sergeant Yusuf Kallenbach. He was about 50, with the kind of weathered face that suggests he'd been a trooper since he was 20. He waited for me to come fully awake. He waited for the nurse to remove the breathing tube and confirm I could speak. And then he said, very gently, "Ma'am, before I tell you what I know, can you tell me what happened?" I told him. Everything. The cabin, the brakes, Sutton walking away, the look on her face. He listened without writing anything down, which I learned later was deliberate. When I finished, he said, "Your sister has filed a missing persons report. She told the responding officer that you'd gone for a drive and never come back, and that she'd been searching for you for 2 days. 2 days. I've been in the hospital for 36 hours. The crash had been 3 days ago." He told me Sutton was at our parents' house in St. Paul. He told me she'd been in contact with our father's life insurance company within 12 hours of reporting me missing, asking what the procedure would be in the event a body was found, asking how long until the policy could be paid out. She didn't know about the contestability period on a recent claim. She didn't know that you can't collect on a beneficiary's policy when you haven't been named beneficiary yourself. She didn't know that life insurance doesn't just hand over money to the dead person's sister because the dead person's sister asks nicely. But what really got Sergeant Kallenbach's attention was the call she'd made to a forensic accountant on the morning of December 20th, asking about how to legally access funds in a recently deceased person's accounts. She'd done it from her own cell phone. From the cabin, while I was bleeding out in a tree 4 miles away. He asked me if I'd be willing to help them build a case. He explained very carefully that if Sutton thought I was alive, if she found out I'd been pulled from the wreck, there was a real possibility she'd disappear, or worse. He said the hospital had registered me as a Jane Doe at his request, pending family identification. The crash had been reported as a single-occupant fatal collision. Body recovered, identification pending. He said, "Your sister thinks you're dead. We like to keep her thinking that for as long as you're comfortable with. I want to tell you I had to think about it. I want to tell you I struggled with the morality. I didn't. I said yes before he finished the sentence. What happened over the next 3 days is something I'll carry with me forever, and I'll tell you about it in pieces because that's how I lived it. On day 1, I called my mother. We did it on a recorded line, with 2 officers and a victim's advocate in the room. I told her I was alive. I told her what Sutton had done. My mother, and I love her. I want you to understand. I love her. My mother said, "Are you sure, sweetheart? Are you absolutely sure?" And I had to listen to her work through 15 years of denial in real time. She came around. She had to. The evidence was overwhelming, and she'd been refusing to see Sutton clearly for too long. She agreed to keep the secret. She agreed to play along. On day 2, Sutton came to our parents' house with a funeral director's brochure. My mother told me about it later. Sutton sat at the kitchen table where we'd eaten Thanksgiving dinners my whole life, and she went through casket options. She was leaning toward the mid-range mahogany. She said Goldie always loved warm wood tones, which was a thing she'd never known about me because Goldie had not loved warm wood tones. Goldie had loved white modern furniture from Crate and Barrel, and Sutton had never spent enough time in my apartment to know that. My mother kept it together. I don't know how. She told Sutton she wanted a small private viewing first, just immediate family, before any larger service. She said she wanted to see her daughter one more time. Sutton agreed enthusiastically. She offered to make the arrangements at the funeral home in St. Paul. I want to pause here for something important, because the comments on stories like this always ask the same question. People always want to know, why didn't the hospital have police protection? Why was she able to walk into anywhere? The answer is that police protection was exactly what I was. I had 2 plainclothes officers on my floor at all times. I had a different name on the chart. The funeral home in St. Paul, where Sutton was making arrangements, was being run as a sting. The funeral director was cooperating. The casket she'd picked out had a sandbag in it, the right weight for a body. The death certificates she'd been shown was a working draft prepared by the medical examiner's office in coordination with the state attorney general's office, marked clearly in their files as evidence in an active investigation. This wasn't a hospital missing a memo. This was a coordinated operation. Sergeant Kallenbach had pulled in the BCA Minnesota's State Bureau within 6 hours of getting my statement. By day 2, there were 11 people working on this, and Sutton had no idea. On day 3, December 23rd, 3 days after she left me in the snow, Sutton arrived at the funeral home for what she'd been told was a private family viewing. She brought my mother's car. She brought a Tupperware container of cookies she'd baked for the funeral director, the same recipe Mom used to make. She wore a black dress she bought at Nordstrom the previous afternoon. We know because the BCA had pulled her credit card statements. She walked into the lobby at 10:14 in the morning. I was in the back office, watching on a closed circuit feed. She did the receiving line first. She accepted condolences from Mrs. Petrosian, who was in on it and who deserves an Academy Award for her performance. She talked to the funeral director, Sergeant Kallenbach, in a borrowed black suit about the order of service. She said she wanted Amazing Grace and a reading from Corinthians. She said she'd written the eulogy herself. She asked when she could see me. Sergeant Kallenbach said, "Whenever you're ready." We've prepared her in the back. The medical examiner did everything he could, but I'd warn you, the injuries to her face and chest were significant. Your mother said she wanted to see her one more time, but she's asked that you go in first. Sutton nodded. She dabbed her eyes. She walked toward the chapel where the casket was. I watched her stop at the doorway. I watched her look down at the closed casket. We told her the lid couldn't stay open due to the trauma, and I watched her face do something strange. A small smile. The same one I'd seen at our kitchen table when she was 19. She walked over to the casket. She put her hand on the lid. And she said in a voice she thought no one could hear, "Finally." That word is on the recording. It's been played in a courtroom. It will be played again, probably for the rest of my life, every time someone files an appeal. She turned around. Sergeant Kallenbach was standing in the doorway with his badge out. There were 2 BCA agents behind him. And I, because I had asked for this, because I had begged for it, because I needed her to understand what had happened, I walked out from the side door of the chapel. She saw me. I have never in my life seen a human face do what her face did in that moment. It went gray. Not pale, gray. Like the blood had stopped moving. Her mouth opened. She made a sound that wasn't a word. Her knees went out from under her and she caught herself on the casket, and she stared at me. And for the first time I had ever seen, my sister looked afraid. I walked over to her. I was on a cane. I'd torn my MCL and broken 2 ribs and lost a lot of blood. I wasn't supposed to be standing for that long, but I'd told them I needed to. I stopped about 3 feet from her. I didn't touch her. I didn't yell. I said, "You picked the mahogany, Sutton." I would have hated the mahogany. The handcuffs went on her at 10:31 in the morning. She didn't resist. She was still making that sound that wasn't a word. She kept looking at me like I was the impossible thing in the room. The trial took 14 months. I want to spare you most of it, but you should know a few things. The brake line tampering was traceable. Forensics matched the cuts to a utility knife found in her car. Her search history was, as I said, 3 weeks of preparation. The text messages on her phone, to Brendan, who took a plea deal almost immediately, included one sent from the cabin at 9:37 in the morning of the crash that read, "It's done. I'll call you when I'm back at the house." She'd sent it before I was even out of the woods. Brendan testified against her. He hadn't known about the brake lines specifically. He thought they'd planned to push me down the cabin stairs and call it a fall. The brake idea had been hers alone. He'd known about the financial pressure, about the loan from Chicago, about the plan to access my insurance money through forged documents Sutton had been preparing for weeks. He got 8 years. He'll be out in 5 with good behavior. Sutton got life without parole. Premeditated attempted murder. Insurance fraud, identity theft for the documents. Conspiracy. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Lorraine Adachi, said in her sentencing that in 31 years on the bench she had rarely seen evidence of a more deliberate, more clinical, more methodical attempt on a family member's life. Sutton didn't cry at sentencing. She stared at the table. My mother and I haven't been the same since. We're closer in some ways and further apart in others. She blames herself for not seeing it sooner. I tell her there was nothing to see, that's what people like Sutton do. They make sure there's nothing to see. But I don't think she'll ever let go of it. She moved out of the house in St. Paul. She sold it within 6 months. The memories were too much. Brendan's family, and I know this sounds strange, reached out to me about a year after the trial. His mother, a kind woman named Adalia, wrote me a letter. She said she'd never trusted Sutton. She said she'd warned Brendan. She said she was sorry, on behalf of her son, for the part he'd played. I wrote back. We exchanged a few letters. She sent me a recipe for plum cake that her own mother used to make. I made it for my own mother last Christmas. We ate it together and didn't talk about Sutton at all. I keep in touch with Sergeant Kallenbach. He retired last year. We have lunch every few months at a diner in Minneapolis. He's the one who told me, the second time we ever met, that the most chilling thing about Sutton wasn't the brake lines or the funeral home or the finale. It was the cookies. She'd brought cookies to the viewing of her own murdered sister. She'd baked them the night before. She'd thought about presentation. She'd put them in a Tupperware container with the lid sealed. People who feel things can't do that, he said. Something has to be missing for someone to do that. And I want to say something about forgiveness here, because people ask me. People want to know if I've forgiven her. I have not. I will not. I am not going to. I want to be careful about how I say this, because I know there's a whole industry built around forgiveness as a virtue. A whole genre of self-help that treats it as a kind of personal hygiene. But I'm a nurse, and I'll tell you what forgiveness is in my profession. Forgiveness is what you offer to someone who made an honest mistake. It's what you give the patient who lashed out because they were scared. It's what you give the family member who said something hurtful in a waiting room at 3 a.m. It is not what you give to someone who cut your brake lines and then waited for the insurance check. What people mean when they tell you to forgive is usually that they're tired of seeing you angry. They want their own discomfort to stop. And I am here to tell you, having been the person on the table, you do not owe anyone your forgiveness. You do not owe it to your family. You do not owe it to your faith, unless your faith is much harsher with you than mine has been with me. You do not owe it to the person who hurt you. What you owe yourself is a life. A real one. A full one. I left nursing for 2 years after the trial. I couldn't be in hospitals. I worked at a bookstore in Stillwater and I got a dog, a rescue greyhound named Pemberton, who is the love of my life, and I went to therapy 3 times a week and I learned how to sleep without checking the locks twice. I'm back at the hospital now. Different unit, same building. My patients don't know any of this, and that's how I want it. I'm engaged to a man named Ruben who I met at the bookstore, who is the kindest person I've ever encountered, and we're getting married in the spring. My mother will walk me down the aisle. If you're watching this, if you're listening to me tell you my story, I want to ask you something. Who in your life are you protecting at the cost of yourself? Whose behavior have you been explaining away? Whose anger have you been absorbing? Whose calls do you take at midnight even though you know, in the part of you that's never wrong, that there is something fundamentally broken in the person on the other end? I am not going to tell you to leave them. I'm not in your life, and I don't know what you're navigating. But I am going to tell you what I learned in a cabin outside Bemidji on the morning of December 20th. Some people, when they tell you who they are telling you the truth. Listen the first time. I'm Marigold. Thank you for being here. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since that morning on the county road, not in any mystical way, in the plain, mechanical way a nurse thinks about it. You don't get pneumonia out of nowhere. Something lets it in. Something was already weakening before the symptoms showed up. Sutton didn't become the woman who cut my brake lines on a Friday in December. She'd been becoming her for 20 years, one small permission at a time. The cat in the duffel bag was a permission. The boyfriend's car burning in his parents' driveway was a permission. Every time my mother said she's just going through something, and every time I went quiet at Thanksgiving and let a comment slide, that was a permission too. We taught her, all of us, that there were no real consequences for who she was. By the time she stood over me in that crumpled car and listened to me breathe, she had every reason in the world to believe she could get away with it. We'd given her every reason for 15 years. I want to tell you what I've learned because it's the only thing I have to offer that's worth anything. Goodness is not soft. I used to think being a good person meant being patient, being forgiving, giving people endless chances to do better. I don't think that anymore. Real goodness has a spine in it. Real goodness sees clearly and acts accordingly. The kindest thing I could have done for Sutton 20 years ago was tell my mother what I knew about Mochi and refuse to let it go until someone listened. I didn't because I was 11 and I was scared, and I understand the 11-year-old me, but I won't be her again. Wisdom, for me, has come down to this. Pay attention to what people show you, not what they tell you. Sutton told me she was sorry. Sutton told me she was changing. Sutton told me she wanted to be a real sister to me, and she said it while she was researching brake line tampering on her phone. The words were performance. The behavior was the truth. I will never again let someone's apology outweigh their pattern. And nerve, the thing I had to find, lying in that hospital bed with a tube down my throat, was nerve, not the cinematic kind, the quiet kind. The kind that says yes when a state trooper asks if you'll let your own funeral be staged. The kind that walks out from a side door on a cane and looks your sister in the eye when every nerve in your body is screaming at you to let someone else handle it. I am not a brave person by nature. But I learned in 3 days that December, that nerve is a muscle. You build it by using it. You start with the small refusals and you work up to the ones that save your life. Whatever's coming for you, I hope you find yours.